Thanks.
Everybody get on the music volume again.
Beck, I think since we're just going to turn off the music.
Got it.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and let everyone in now. Jess, I'll let you know when it looks like the number stops going up.
Yep, that sounds good. We'll give everyone a couple of minutes to join. Hi, everyone who's joining us.
Okay, Jess, I think we're good to start.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here today. Welcome. This is our third seminar in our Environmental Justice Brown Bag series. My name is Jessica Rednick. I am a Sea Grant Social Science Extension Specialist based at the Delta Stewardship Council. And I'm so excited to have us in for our third of the talks in this 4-part series. We've been organizing this Environmental Justice Brown Bag series as part of our effort to begin to build more attention around the social and environmental justice issues in the California Delta. The Delta Stewardship Council is embarking on a new initiative to develop an environmental justice issue paper and to integrate more social sciences throughout our work. And so as part of that effort to build more attention and knowledge and capacity around these issues, we've been bringing in experts from across the country who focus on different aspects of environmental justice scholarship and activism. And we had our first talk in September focused on water justice and the human right to water, featuring Laurel Firestone, a State Water Resources Control Board member, and Dr. Kristen Dobbin, a postdoc at UCLA. We had our second talk in October with Dr. Jill Harrison, talking about environmental justice reforms in government agencies. And both of those talks are recorded and the presentations are available for anybody who missed them on the council's YouTube website. And then after our talk today, which we'll introduce our speaker in just a minute now, we have one final talk in this series from Dr. Raul Levianos, professor at University of Oregon, who will be talking about racialized disparities in sea level rise risk. So just a few housekeeping logistics for today. There is a chat function and a Q&A feature where you can submit your questions or comments for our speaker. We're going to hold all questions until the end, and we'll moderate the Q&A for Dr. White. So we hope that questions all are respectful and stay on topic, of course, and we look forward to a lively discussion after the talk. So thank you again for spending your lunch hour with us, and I'll pass it over to Karen to introduce our speaker for today.
Okay, thanks, Jess. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our talk today. I am Karen Gutierrez, the 2021 California Sea Grant Fellow in Science Communication. And as Jess mentioned, I will now be introducing just some of Dr. Kyle White's extensive background and work in environmental justice. So Dr. White is a professor of environment and sustainability at the University of Michigan. There, his research addresses environmental justice, climate policy, and the ethics of cooperative relationships between Indigenous peoples and science organizations, as well as problems of Indigenous justice in public and academic discussions of food sovereignty, environmental justice, and the Anthropocene. He is also an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Dr. White currently serves on a number of environmental justice committees, including the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. He is a leader in climate and environmental justice and has worked on several task forces at different levels of government, including serving as an author for the U.S. Global Change Research Program and for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in Working Group 2. So without further ado, I will now pass it on to Dr. White so he can begin his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. And I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate your work and that of the other organizers. Great to get to know everything that folks are doing in that part of the world. And I'm going to speak today to some kind of ways to understand Indigenous peoples and environmental justice, with an emphasis on climate change, but it's connected to a lot of other different types of environmental issues. And I'd also then like to say a few things before closing about one of the current policies in the Biden-Harris administration on environmental justice, given that many of you are likely going to be in the position to interact with this policy. And I think it has tremendous implications for the well-being of the people that you serve in the work that you're doing. So in terms of just the work I do, and I'm not going to describe too many things further beyond what was mentioned in the introduction, but I'm a Potawatomi tribal member, and a lot of my work has been focused on the conservation of native plants and animals and ecosystems within the Great Lakes region. And I live in our Potawatomi and Anishinaabe homelands in the Great Lakes. And so for me, it's very important to really be serving in those water and environmental protector and guardian functions. A lot of my work is focused on empowering students into leadership in climate change and environmental justice who are studying at tribal colleges and universities. I've worked with the Sustainable Development Institute at the College of Menominee Nation for many years, and currently work with the American Indian Higher Education Association, which is or consortium, which is a consortium of all of the tribal colleges that support programs for those tribal colleges and universities. I'm active in grassroots and frontline organizing. I'm one of the founding members and currently the chairperson of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, where we do work supporting Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities on the front lines of many different environmental stressors, threats, including climate change. And we're doing a lot of work right now to ensure a just and equitable transition to a renewable energy system. I'm a professor at one of the oldest programs in environmental justice in academia, started by Professor Bunyan Bryant when he was one of the first African-American faculty members at the University of Michigan in the 1970s. And so I'm kind of part of the next chapter of growing our environmental justice program at the School for Environment and Sustainability, and really building on the legacy of so many fantastic scholars, especially scholars of color, who have really worked over the years to grow our program and support our alumni. Some groups and organizations I've worked with, you should definitely look up. The Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians has a substantive program on climate change, as well as connections to environmental justice with respect to treaty rights. For the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, our recommendations and some of the guidance that's been offered in response to our recommendations is available on our website. I used to serve on a federal advisory committee on climate change in the Department of Interior. And the Department of Interior continues to support diverse climate change programs, including the Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Climate Resilience Program, which has an excellent set of resources on the various things that tribes are doing to prepare for climate change. The U.S. National Climate Assessment's gearing up for another report, and it's going to have a chapter again focused on tribes and Indigenous people, as well as for the first time having a chapter that's focused on social systems. And so pertinent to this speaker series, look a year or two from now for that chapter to emerge. But actually, I'll email the organizers. There will be a public comment period for the initial drafting of some of those chapters, and one of the first public meetings is coming up fairly soon. But it'll be a key chapter on social systems. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change continues to deepen its connection to social science work, as well as with relevance to Indigenous people. And so I've served as an author attempting to create space within the IPCC for Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous experience, Indigenous understandings of climate change. Another important group you should check out that I've interacted with as part of my work supporting Native students within climate science is the Rising Voices Center, Climate Resilience through Indigenous and Earth Sciences that's at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. I've served on the advisory board for one of the largest Indigenous research organizations in the world, Napa Aotearoa, which is a Maori research institution in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm currently on the board of the Pesticide Action Network North America. And so in terms of environmental justice and Indigenous people, in the context of the US, it's important to have a sense of what we mean by Indigenous people. And this absolutely relates to the tribal nations and Indigenous people in California. And so for us, right, we're communities that are self-governance pre-existed the United States. We were here before, and we were doing our own thing before, and we had our own cultures, our own governance systems. And today, we still exercise self-governance, though different communities face different barriers and limits. But because our sovereignty, our self-determination is older than the United States, many of our communities are still participating in those traditions of calling our own shots, making our own decisions, developing our own governance institutions. And so if you look at the total area of lands that the governments of tribal nations administer, it's many millions of acres. It includes agriculture and forests and lands with other types of resources and dimensions to them. But we also practice our own cultures on those lands. And our cultures are integral to our family life, our kinship, our educational systems. And so something like environmental justice, which has to do with inequality and fairness and equity, for us is going to have a direct relationship to our ability to regulate the environments that matter to us. So environmental injustice to us is both a matter of being overburdened by pollution, of being dispossessed of our lands to make way for some of the industries that are the dirtiest in the world. But it's also an issue that we haven't been able to consent to any of that that's happened to us. And so consent has to do with self-governance, with our sovereignty. And so environmental justice, and some of you may have seen this in different cases where tribes have claimed that they are being affected by environmental justice, it's both about the disproportionate physical burdens we face and about the fact that we were never consulted or consented to any of those dirty industries being located on our lands. And so as Indigenous people, we have a long history of living right next to some of the dirtiest industries, whether it's the nuclear industry, especially with respect to uranium mining, the coal industry, the oil and gas industries, living in areas where our forest lands were deforested or urbanized, paper mills, you name the industrial facility, there have been companies that realized that because of the United States' disrespect for our sovereignty, that locating their facilities near to our communities meant that those companies didn't need to pay attention as much to safety standards, that they didn't need to pay attention to whether we actually benefited economically from those industries that were nearby. And today it's been especially challenging because the presence of certain industries, especially in the fossil fuel sector, have been tied to sexual violence and human trafficking against Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit people, non-binary people. And that's been an unfortunate way in which many tribes have been treated over generations, where gender inequity, sexual abuse has been related to land dispossession and the undermining of our governance systems. So it's not surprising that Indigenous people are some of the most adamant communities taking action to address climate change. In the last climate assessment, the Bureau of Indian Affairs worked with some of the authors on the climate assessment, as well as other colleagues, and started collecting information about how much Native people were doing to address climate change. And if you look at the Bureau of Indian Affairs website now, there's well over 1,000 actions. And those actions are really just talking about planning, educational, and adaptation actions. And so if you add to the fact that any attempt to calculate all the things that Indigenous people are doing is probably going to be off by a third, right? So it's probably triple what's shown here. But also add, right, that Indigenous people are resisting the fossil fuel industry through direct action, through water protectorship, through land protectorship, it multiplies to many, many thousands of actions. And so, if you think about Indigenous people who are from California, who have been there longer than the state of California, they're taking action to address climate change, and they're probably taking relatively more action than other people within the state of California. But if we add all of the resistance, and the Indigenous Environmental Network and Oil Change International produced this report just talking about how Indigenous direct action has actually lowered global carbon footprints because it stopped some of the dirtiest companies from engaging in fossil fuel extraction. And so we're some of the main architects of both mitigating climate change, but also finding ways to acknowledge and prepare for climate change. And part of the injustice of it is that the main causes of climate change, the dirty industries and the land use practices that drastically change the environment in places like California or Michigan, that those changes have made us more vulnerable. They shrunk our land base. They changed the resilience of those landscapes. And those are the places that we're living in. And so the environmental justice issues of climate change are not just ones that are tied to the current way in which climate change affect places where Indigenous people live, but it's also that where we live and the size of the land base and the quality of the environments where we live has greatly been affected by, for some communities, centuries of land dispossession and other environmental stressors caused by other industries, other types of environmental injustices. And so in the last climate assessment in the Tribal and Indigenous Peoples chapter, there were 3 key messages. And it's important to note that this message here talks about the threats that Indigenous people face: economic threats, cultural threats, subsistence threats, threats tied to economic development of all sorts of different types of industries. But you can't separate those threats from the institutional barriers that make it more challenging for Indigenous people to respond proactively to climate change. Indigenous people have long known what the threats were, but there are bureaucratic hurdles, a lack of consultation, nation-nation consultation, and that creates, in turn, a lack of coordination between Indigenous people, the federal government, local government, state government, and it means that it's, for us, something that makes it much slower for us to be able to take the measures that we know that we need to take. And the second key message, and this really is part of the inequity of climate change, is our health is at stake. And it's not just our physical health. Climate change that reduces the prevalence of certain animals, for example, or certain plants. Sometimes those are animals or plants that we depend on for nutrition, and nutrition that's hard to replicate if we're thinking about other places that we would get food if we couldn't rely on those plants or those animals. And so you have those effects, the physical nutritional effects, but then if you're from a community where you've watched and your ancestors have watched your land base shrink, you've experienced relocation like my tribal community did in the last 2 centuries ago, that has an effect psychologically. It affects your mental health because that's the landscape where your cultural histories, your stories, your history, it takes place in that landscape, and the traces of that history, that culture, that memory are things that a lot of us, if we've never been faced with such threats, we take it for granted. But for communities whose lands have been put in peril, it's not just the lands, it's not just the economy in terms of dollars, it's the family practices, the kinship bonds. It's also an understanding that your political sovereignty is respected, living in an environment where you know that you're from a nation that's older than the United States, but that the United States doesn't respect that. That has a mental health effect. And so if climate change policies exclude Native people, if they don't consult us at the earliest phases, that has an overall mental health effect. And so we're also facing this traumatic aspect of climate change, that we're not just treating it as something that's new and unprecedented that affects the status quo that was okay. The status quo was not okay. And now we're experiencing a compounding of some of the most negative aspects of what the status quo has been. And in another key message, some of the most severe impacts of climate change right now, it's Indigenous people that are on the front lines of those severe impacts. It's Indigenous people that are having to make very difficult plans and take action to resettle due to things like coastal erosion. But if you look at each of those cases, whether it's in the Louisiana area or Alaska or other parts of the US, again, the US has not set up an institutional framework to make it so that those communities that are facing the challenges of resettlement can do so in a way that's going to be good for their well-being, good for their economy, good for the continuance of their culture. And so this is why in a recent paper that myself and an amazing team of folks just recently published, which you can find in Science, we showed, based on a lot of hard work with a lot of data, that if you actually look at the historical land holdings of tribes and compare that to where tribal nations are at right now in terms of their land base, that tribal vulnerability to climate change, the severity of the vulnerability, it's worse on the lands that tribes are on now. And so the United States actually moved tribes into areas that we know now are more vulnerable to climate change if you line that up with current climate change information. And in the paper, we also found that Indigenous people are in situations where they're oftentimes closer to particular types of federal lands that make it hard for those tribes to expand or to take adaptive actions. And we also saw, even though we don't support subsurface oil and gas industries, but the tribes were very deliberately placed on land that at the time were not thought of by the US to be ones that were valuable for the growing US energy system. And so tribes were cut out of the energy sector. And so according to the data, it's land dispossession that drives vulnerability to climate change. It's not that Native people are in the wrong place at the wrong time. There's a reason why Native people live in the places that they do and live in climate vulnerable places and have very few options to adapt. And it's because of US colonialism and the continuation of US colonialism. Remember, the US official policy, word for word, is that US Congress has plenary power over tribes, meaning the US believes itself to even have authority over who tribes designate as their own members of their communities. And so to really understand environmental justice as it affects Native people, we have to understand the compounded history of land dispossession. And we have to be educated on all these different policies. And I'm not going to go over any of these. I'm just putting them up there to give you a sense. You have to understand all the policies that facilitated land dispossession. And we really have to ask ourselves what's changed, what's worked, and what can we learn from the various problems and challenges of the past, and how can we get beyond this kind of colonial moment that's been going on for many decades at this point. And so climate change then doesn't occur in the absence of the other environmental justice issues that tribes are facing. Tribes are still facing a denial of their treaty rights. Many tribes sign treaties with the United States, which, because they're ratified by Congress, have the authority like a statute does. And obviously, many of you know in California, due to the state's desire to exploit Native people as laborers, they convinced the US Congress to not ratify a number of treaties that California tribes had entered into. And so they exist as executive agreements and not treaties. And so, for this reason, right, there's just a continual disrespect for treaty rights. And we know land dispossession continues as well. Mining, extraction, industrial pollution burdens continue to be felt extremely by many tribal communities. I was just at an event in Chicago a couple of weeks ago where, colleagues you should look up, like Tommy Rock from the Navajo Nation, were discussing the fact that they're still experiencing the negative health impacts from the uranium mining industry, and that they're still trying to get federal agencies and others to take those health impacts seriously. And so those issues haven't gone away. Native people still experience racism, assimilation, and segregation. For example, in a lot of the work on climate change, we're often in the position of trying to argue, like, wait a minute, we have our own scientific traditions from many years ago, but we're always told that there's only one type of science, and that's the science that non-native people exercise, that American settlers exercise. And so we still experience a lot of discrimination like that, just in terms of people not respecting our knowledge, our experiences, our testimonies. There continue to be environmental justice issues affecting all sorts of federal lands, refuge lands, national parks. It's something that if you look it up, you'll find just numerous examples. Tribes have engaged in just tremendous organizing to try to protect lands that are ultimately controlled by executive branch or congressional decisions or court decisions. And again, these are lands that are central to our cultures, to our histories, and in a lot of cases to our economies as well. So, you can see, right, these aren't just issues of disproportionality in terms of burdens of pollution, but they're issues of disrespect of our sovereignty, of our way of life, of our culture, of our knowledge. And so a lot of the prominent issues today that receive a lot of media attention have to do with pipelines and have to do with the fossil fuel transportation sector. And it's important to put these issues in context with all the other environmental justice issues that are affecting tribes in every single tribal nation I know. And if we just stick with the federally recognized tribes, the 574 at least, each tribe is dealing with multiple environmental justice issues. There's very few tribes that would say that they just have one. They're dealing with many at one time, and that's been the case historically. And so when we go back to this issue of climate equity, the energy transition, we always want to put it in context that it's not just a unique issue. It's one that's situated in this larger history as it relates to contemporary challenges that tribes are facing and risks that tribes are facing from a lot of different sources. And so when we look at information like this, that was recently published about the fact that it's wealthy people that are refusing the change and that they have a high carbon footprint. They have a huge responsibility for carbon footprint. It's important to note that it's not an accident, right? These are people who themselves, their ancestors, their wealth was built off of stealing the lands of Indigenous people on exploitative labor practices, as well as land dispossession that affected Black and Brown people, both in the United States, but also in the global majority. And so we're not just thinking through people who are privileged and are simply trying to protect their privilege. It's that they wouldn't have been in that position of privilege in the first place if it hadn't been for all of these policy, legal, violent, and other actions that their ancestors undertook in order to ensure that their present generation retained that wealth. And so for them, oftentimes, a climate change impact is just something that would affect their pocketbooks, but it's not something that they believe would affect their culture or their way of life, and would erase their history and their ancestral connections, right to the heart of who they are as people. They don't experience it in that way. So recent reports like this really amazing one called the Status of Tribes and Climate Change report that was convened by the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals and supported by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It had over 99 authors, all of whom have on-the-ground experience working on tribal climate change issues, as well as over 33 or over 36 testimonies directly from tribal practitioners talking about multiple climate change issues, from energy sector issues to biodiversity to ecosystem services to traditional knowledge, that is the knowledge that Native people have about the environment. And if you look, and I'm not going to read these, but if you look at the recommendations that come out of that report, notice these are not recommendations that just say things like lessen this impact or ensure that there's resources to cover the cost of having to endure a particular climate change impact. Notice that the recommendations have to do with supporting tribal sovereignty, supporting respect for Indigenous people's knowledge, having a place at the table for Indigenous experience and testimony and knowledge and leadership, and ensuring that these institutional issues that were brought out in the National Climate Assessment, these institutional barriers that make it very, very hard for many tribal nations to respond to climate change, are fixed. And so here's some of the further recommendations. These are recommendations that come out of the fact that it's land dispossession that is the great factor making climate change vulnerability so severe for Native people. And so these are solutions that come out of people that know that the solution, or that what's needed, is the restoration and recovery of Indigenous self-determination, Indigenous sovereignty, and the regrowth of Indigenous cultural traditions, social traditions, the strengthening the fabric of Indigenous communities, which includes actually leadership within the energy sector, and that tribes really need to emerge as leaders within the energy sector. So it's not an accident that Native people are this adamant about addressing climate change. It's important to note that for us, climate science is not a new science. Like my community, Anishinaabe people, going back to our ancient time, we never defined ourselves as discrete nations. We defined ourselves as kinship structures that people participated in more than one governing unit. And there wasn't a central capital. There were multiple capitals that existed and popped up and disappeared at different times of the year. And so we developed a whole governing system based on how to be responsive to seasonal change around us, as well as keeping track of longer term change, something like climate change. And so for us, you couldn't have political science or philosophy or educational science without climate science. You couldn't have diplomacy without climate science. You could have economic science without climate science. Climate science is not new. It doesn't mean that we have all these answers to how we're going to get out of the current climate change crisis. But what it does mean that we're coming at it from a different perspective. We're thinking about what it means to have been tracking climate change for many generations, and even having ancient stories about how people adapted to climate change in the past and how they took measures to be more prepared for climate change that was happening. And so oftentimes for Anishinaabe and other groups, we're able to demonstrate our knowledge systems through these seasonal round or seasonal models of our ways of life. And it's important to note, right, that oftentimes when we talk about just the experience, no matter who you are, as like a Native person, we talk about just the experience of climate change. It's really a different way of telling time. For Anishinaabe people, I've sort of thought through our philosophy. And it's really a philosophy where we assume that stability is not the norm, but actually constant change is the norm. And so we're always experiencing change around us. Whether it's changes in seasons or changes in when different plants show up or animals show up or disappear. But whenever we observe these changes, we're always thinking about the different ceremonies, the activities, the economic things, the political things that we do that come about when those different changes are occurring. And so this is a way of thinking about time. You can get rid of the clock and just think about what would it mean to think about time in a way where you organized your day, you organized your commitments according to what you knew was supposed to happen when certain environmental changes occur. And so for a lot of communities, like with Anishinaabe people, throughout the year, there's different kinship responsibilities that are happening. And kinship responsibilities is really a concept that Native people are trying to take back from the way it was kind of ruined by fields like anthropology and other areas. We're trying to take it back. And I think for a lot of Indigenous conceptions, contemporary conceptions of kinship, it refers to that important institutional aspect of our society that gives us that fabric of mutual aid, that fabric of support, that support network. And so kinship qualities or kinship responsibilities have relational qualities. It means having this web, this network, including with non-humans, that's trustworthy, reciprocal, consensual, respectful, inclusive. These are the qualities that you want to have with your relationships to others, because they're the qualities that create that web, that network that supports you, that supports your freedom, but also supports you when you're in a jam, when there's a crisis, when there's an emergency. And so it's a way of telling time. You can think about the experience of time through the ebb and flow and the growth or disparagement of kinship qualities, right? The expansion and contraction of kinship qualities throughout time. And so I think it's important, right, that if we accept that climate science is just an older, a deeper science for us in different ways, then we have to think through some of those indigenous ways of having a different orientation to climate change than at least the one that I was exposed to in dominant educational institutions, where it was all about discoveries in the 19th century that got us in the position to be able to track climate change and its relationship to increased concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and the sort of the unprecedentedness of the change. But for Indigenous people, if you think about the blue as several hundred years, right, and the red as several thousands of years, that way of thinking that I just described is kind of just a colonial assumption about time. It sort of makes it seem like all the major stuff that happened in the world occurred during the 200 or so years that the US has been around, the industrial period, the period that's responsible for the current greenhouse gas issues. And then anything that happened before that is just sort of considered to be not a big deal, sort of random history or primitive history. And the whole goal of climate advocacy under these assumptions is to sort of maintain what privileged people consider to be the normal conditions today, the industrial conditions, and trying to figure out ways to respond to lower carbon footprint, but that won't be that disruptive to that very particular way of understanding the basic norms of a way of life. But for Indigenous ways of telling time, it would be a little bit different, right? For Anishinaabe people, we consider the current period to be a small period within a much larger history, a history where we actually know that there were previous climate change periods and that we have stories about how people responded to them. And none of those stories, at least as far as I know, had the solution that that some technological innovation saved the day. That's just not in there. But for us, right, we've got these long dynamic histories, and right now we find ourselves in one of the shorter periods of history, but it's one where we're living under colonial conditions. We're living under racial capitalism, and we're living under a number of other oppressive systems to make it hard for us just to live our lives and to exercise our own self-determination that, like I was saying before, pre-exists the US and any state. And so we're not trying to take anything granted about today. We're trying to get out of the situation that we're in today, because nobody wants to be living under colonial conditions. And so for us, we view climate change as part of the actions that we've already been taking to support our self-determination, but actually to create just a better world. And not only for Indigenous people, but for Black people, for Brown people, for diverse communities in the global majority, for people suffering from the barriers that they face from low income. And so this is a bit of a different way of thinking about climate change, right? But it comes out of that experience of being people that, thought a lot about how climate change relates to society. And for us, it's very clear that we wouldn't be in this climate crisis if it wasn't for colonialism, racial capitalism, and the different ways in which patriarchy and ableism have been part of those oppressive systems, have been central to those systems. So in that same report I was mentioning earlier, some fantastic colleagues then created this model for how Indigenous people who testified and wrote in that report were understanding climate change. And so you note that it's got everything from, futurity to climate change impacts, to a reference to ancestors and memory, to the impacts of colonialism, and then all the specific issues that those relate to. And so this is kind of an Indigenous system of thinking about climate change. So circling back, to environmental justice, I think it's very much a matter as it relates to climate change of recognizing that climate science is not new. Human-caused climate change is actually not new either, given that colonialism is actually a kind of human-caused environmental change. Oppression is a root cause of the impacts of climate change. And solutions without kinship perpetuate harms. And so this is the idea that if a kinship relationship is one that has mutual aid and support wrapped up within it, I wouldn't characterize the relationships right now between, say, a country like the United States or particular states and indigenous people as ones that are indicative of a kinship relationship, right? They should be, but they're not kinship relationships. And a kinship relationship doesn't need to be like some kind of biological family thing. It's a way of thinking about all of your relationships, whether with more familiar people or people that you're less familiar with, but you're trying to have relationships that are consensual and reciprocal, trustworthy, accountable, and so forth. So in this way, we can understand a lot of different relationships in terms of their kinship aspects. Now, I just wanted to conclude by talking very briefly about one of the current environmental justice initiatives that has a lot of steam right now in the US context, and that I think you can understand it importantly in relation to the histories that I just described. But this is an initiative that's for all people, right? It's an environmental justice initiative, but it's called the Justice 40 policy. And the Justice 40 policy has been something that's been actually around for a while. So it was actually inspired by, some of the policies in California, where some of the revenue from the carbon programs was to be directed toward disadvantaged communities. And so in the Biden-Harris administration, Executive Order 14008, they created this initiative called Justice 40, which is the idea that when the federal government implements massive investments in climate resilience infrastructure, in sanitation infrastructure, in energy infrastructure, and other environmental types of infrastructure, as well as the workforce development investments that go along with that, 40% of the benefits have to go to disadvantaged communities. And that would include a number of low-income communities, tribal nations, Black and Brown communities. And it's a whole of government approach. It's not EPA. It's all agencies need to be doing this. They need to have a plan for how they're going to do it, which means they need to define things like what does 40% mean in terms of a benefit. But essentially what the program is trying to do is rethink what justice means. Justice is not just about a macro investment that's shifted toward, say, tribal nations, and the government washes its hands of that. Rather, it's the idea that actually what federal agencies need to be doing is making up for the fact that for a lot of tribal nations, we've dealt with 200 years of infrastructure disinvestment. So it's not just that we'd like to have investments in renewable energy infrastructure, it's we need all the other investments that would be needed to actually mount in a renewable energy infrastructure program, a meaningful one that would support our communities, but also support our economies. We need the water infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure, the broadband infrastructure, the electrification infrastructure. All of that stuff needs to be folded into this, but those are the things that have been produced by generations of having never benefited at all from any period where the US intensively invested in infrastructure. And so in the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, we set out to make recommendations on Justice 40. And right now, the current update on that is that we are working directly in some cases with agencies to figure out how those agencies should operate to make good on Justice 40. And this is contributing to each agency developing their own Justice 40 plan. But there's also the development of an economic and climate justice screening tool, which will be a data-driven tool that will help agencies identify which communities qualify for Justice 40. And so you should check out our recommendations on our website, as well as what's called the White House Interim Guidance on Justice 40. I think that's probably the most important document right now, because it lays out some preliminary groundwork about how the Justice 40 initiative is going to be implemented. But literally, if you take the potential tens of billions of dollars in infrastructure funding that's currently on the table in Congress, once that starts flowing, but Justice 40 applies to all other money, by the way, but that's the one that has the most focus right now. Once that money begins to be spent, it has to be spent in a way where you get that 40% benefit for disadvantaged communities. And so the colleagues on the White House Council have had to work with trying to define, like, disadvantaged communities. Is that even the appropriate term? What does it mean? Having to identify the fact that it can't just be about a brute investment, but has to be about restoring financial institutions, community-based financial institutions, ensuring that contractors come from the communities that are receiving the investment, supporting entrepreneurship and community growth, supporting ownership of infrastructure and ownership of all the other assets and other things that go into, you know, genuine transformation in the infrastructure. So this is an important initiative to track, but it's one that is, whether it's able to be put in practice or not, related to the situation that so many communities face that have experienced these legacies of colonialism and are now in a situation where we're not just attempting to seek environmental justice through remediation of one source pollutant or remediation of one dirty industry, but actually are thinking about the overall sovereignty and self-determination of our communities, even at the level of infrastructure. And while I've discussed in more focused detail Indigenous people and tribal nations, there's an absolutely analogous conversation happening with Black communities, brown communities, rural communities. So anyways, I'll close there, but I look forward to engaging further with everybody.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kyle, so much for that talk. Covered a lot of ground and a lot of good ideas to keep learning and thinking about. So we'll open it up for audience questions now. We have a couple in our Q&A box that we'll start with, but I encourage everyone else to add more as they come to mind. And I'll start with our first question that speaks to the fact that the Delta is a very important area for tribes. And this question asks about the Delta Conveyance Project, which is framed as a project to address climate change and environmental justice issues in the Central Valley. And you may or may not, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the project itself, but the comment speaks to the fact that there's been little consultation, and it's a continual infrastructure project that perpetuates cultural genocide that has been conducted by the state of California in the past. The question asks, how do you propose that tribes work with the state to find a better solution to a project like this? Do you have any thoughts or recommendations?
Yeah, well, I'm really sorry to hear about those experiences and the damages of that project. You know, in the type of work that I do, everywhere I go or with people I connect with, I hear about, these different stories, and obviously, firsthand see the sorts of things that happen in Michigan. And, the state itself needs to change. The state itself actually needs to develop its own consultation policy that actually is grounded in consent, that is actually grounded in early involvement, like at the point of conception, not involvement later on. I think the project needs to really be regrounded in Indigenous futurity. Whose futurity is at stake in this? And often these infrastructure projects, they assume a certain model of futurity, and that gets baked into their planning process. And I think in the case of California, when I go to different states or different countries, there's, while every state or country is currently guilty of massive human rights violations against Indigenous people, there's definitely several places that I've noted have been particularly recalcitrant to address those issues. And certainly California is one of those states. And I think actually a human rights policy, especially if it's one that some of the leaders in California, Democratic leaders, would be willing to embrace, would go a long way. But ultimately, if engineers and others who are involved in infrastructure continue to bring attitudes of expediency and assumptions about what they believe the future is, these projects are going to continue to recycle the problems. And the last thing I'll just say, and I don't really think that we should be judging the types of things that we say, whether they're like pessimistic or optimistic or hopeful or not. I think we just need to address the problems as they are and take action to address the problems without having to rest assured that we know our efforts are going to lead to a change that we'll experience in our lifetime. But it really needs to be put out there that we're dealing with a situation, and this project as described appears to be really indicative of what I'm about to say, that while people overall might be getting more serious about doing things to address climate change, the underlying colonial mechanisms have not changed. And so we see projects like what's been horrifically described as just continuing to go on. And we're going to have a situation where 50 or 60 years from now, those generations are going to look back on our time in the same way that we look back at like the late 19th century and say, wow, I would have never done something, genocidal or done something that was assimilating or dispossessing people. And I think people need to wake up and realize that this current generation may not be as different as they think from previous generations. It just might appear to be different. And so we need to take actions to make sure that we're looked at, as a lot of Native folks like Robin Kimmer say, as good ancestors.
Great. Thank you for that answer. Yeah, so I have another question from the chat, and this person would like to know if you work with any folks focused on claiming Indigenous water rights in the Western U.S., and as climate change exacerbates water scarcity and many water rights are already claimed in the West, they would also like to know how you foresee these water rights being reinstated.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I don't work that much kind of in that area of the US, so I just know, some of the very basics, but a couple things that I just wanted to note, and I have a feeling the person that asked the question might know more than I do but on that particular topic, and maybe about Michigan too, if they happen to be from Michigan as well. So anyways, I think with respect to water rights, it's important for people, especially in the quote unquote Western areas, to really understand the history of water rights and the various mechanisms have been put in play. There's some tribes that are related to something called the Winters Doctrine, but there's many tribes that's not something they can use. There's tribes that control their own regulatory programs tied to water quality and other aspects related to water, which actually gives them certain rights that federal agencies will enforce if an off-reservation entity or person does something that affects those tribes' regulatory standards. And then there's the court cases, the agreements over water usage, and so on. And so, in Michigan, where I live, for example, these issues of water are tied to, for a lot of tribes, the reassertion and defense of their treaty rights. But again, in other parts of the West, something like treaty rights are not available in the same way that they are in areas like Oregon or Washington or Michigan or Wisconsin. So I think I'll just stop there on that question, but I'm sorry I couldn't go a little bit further, but I appreciate your asking that.
That was great. Some good thoughts and more to look into there. This question, and I'm glad you were able to cover some of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council's thoughts on the Justice 40 initiative. This question digs into that a little bit more. Are there concerns about the screening tool's ability to accurately represent smaller or rural communities and how this might affect their eligibility for Justice 40 funding or their otherwise consideration in that group of disadvantaged communities? And the question goes on to ask, what types of recommendations or safeguards might you suggest for agencies looking to map-based tools to determine eligibility for funding, and which communities are the focus of these policies and programs?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of frustration with that process right now with the screening tools. And I want to suggest a couple of avenues for, for thinking about how, we can begin to kind of turn the situation around. And so what essentially happened was in mid-May, the White House EJ Advisory Council made recommendations on the screening tools, and the 26 people on the council are people with the types of experiences that it sounds like the colleague that asked a question have, right? Which is that we know that these processes, they miss communities, they marginalize communities, they ignore communities, and that because you might have a process that's in place that federal agencies follow, the federal agencies don't feel that they need to do any better. And I obviously know about in California, the history of Cal EnviroScreen, and obviously California has a lot kind of in relation to these federal efforts. But so anyways, there was supposed to be a prototype released mid-summer of the screening tools, which would able to be publicly commented on by some of these different advisory bodies. But the actual committee charged with developing the prototype hasn't actually been able to release the prototype. And it's actually not the committee, it's the U.S. Digital Service and the Office of Management and Budget. And so they're charged to work with the Council on Environmental Quality to develop the prototype. And so the prototype still hasn't been shared yet. And I believe, we don't fully know all the reasons why, but obviously just to put out there that anything like this has to go through a lot of layers of legal review and policy review and so on. However, what I would say is currently online, the U.S. Digital Service has a group called the Justice 40 Open Source Group, which I'd encourage anybody to sign up for. And it's a group of USDS software engineers and other people with those skill sets talking about it. But what concerns me about some of the different conversations I've been in nationally regarding the screening tools is there's a difference between having like expertise, to put a weird word on it, in justice and equity, including through one's own experiences, and then somebody with software skills or certain types of engineering skills who actually might have never had that type of experience before or have that type of knowledge. And so I am really, really worried actually that the screening tool will ignore and exclude certain groups. On the Indigenous people side, I've been working very hard to try to find solutions to some of the ways in which tribal nations don't show up. If you look at a lot of the current environmental justice issues that tribes face that are very prominent, those issues wouldn't have been flagged by the national data sets that are going into the screening tool. And so what do we do about that? And another issue is that some of the information is stuff that Native people don't want out there in the public, right? Because other people might pillage or exploit what's on those territories if that was made more publicly available or salient. So there are tremendous risks with the screening tools, and time is running out because without the screening tools, the federal agencies won't be able to implement Justice 40, as the person asked the question pointed out. And so that's exactly kind of where we're at right now, but we're hoping within a couple of months to finally get a response about the prototype from CEQ, OMB, and USDS.
Great. It really points to that needing for intersectional training and the skill sets to be shared across folks who have training in justice fields and the data science fields. And I think, I look forward to seeing what the comments on the tool look like and how that progresses. So I think we'll go with one more question for now, since we got started a couple minutes after the hour, and this will probably close us out. So before we do the final question, I just want to say a final thanks to you, Dr. White, for being here and sharing your experiences and expertise with us. I think this was an excellent addition to our series here, and I hope a lot of learning and continued conversations spur out of this. So final question from the audience. The audience member starts with a thank you for a wonderful presentation and asks if you have ideas for big picture design frameworks that embrace the kinship model that can be translated down to granular decisions about project budgets and schedules. In other words, how do we move from that kinship theory into implementation and practice of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question. And I'll just respond super briefly since we're wrapping up here. But so the way that I've tried to understand it, and I didn't have a chance to spend too much time on this in the presentation itself, but I've actually chosen to interpret kinship as referring to the types of things that are built into the processes that you're mentioning. So for example, I oftentimes don't talk about kinship in terms of things like harmony or relationality. I believe that those are all part of it, right? But when I look at kinship, it's referring to actually having standards of consent, like cultures of consent, cultures of accountability measures, trust building measures, reciprocity, right? Which, concerns ways in which different people not only don't exploit each other, but harness the best of their talents to be able to work together, different types of talents. And so I've chosen to go with certain types of norms that I think are ones that are already oftentimes present in processes, even if they're not ones that have been good for people of color or Indigenous people. But they're things I think a lot of planners can understand, and that they have discharged and implemented in different ways. I also wanted to mention, as somebody that's worked with a lot of tribes on their climate change planning processes and so on, I mean, the processes that I used to develop and do so collaboratively with tribes, we would follow different approaches to Indigenous planning. There are whole theories of Indigenous planning. There's an Indigenous Planning and Design Institute at the University of New Mexico. And so these actual processes, right, would be ones where from the beginning to the very end, we were using a kinship way of organizing the collaboration, the partnership, and so on. And that would actually translate eventually into things like how, budgets were created and articulated. And one of the challenges, though, with the kinship, and I've served as an advisor and negotiator for different tribes that are facing fairly extreme environmental challenges, but that it becomes very hard to implement kinship things quickly when you've had a history of kinship violations. And I think for planners as well, one of the things that people aren't taught in school is how to deal with situations where, even if you believe you're providing participatory opportunities and rational forms of democratic engagement, we're actually in a situation where many tribal and people of color communities are living with trauma. And some of the same things have been offered before. At least it sounded like that. And so I think for a lot of planners, and I've had to deal with this myself as part of my own work, really have to confront what it means to work under conditions of sedimented disempowerment, of trauma. I think it shapes what our expectations are. And I think that that's important to consider. And it's important to think through what the actual strategies would be to be able to both provide what needs to be provided in terms of planning and oversight and project accountability, but to do so in ways that lead to transformational change and that don't end up deepening problems that have existed for some time. Thanks for your question. Sorry I couldn't say more about it, but I know we got to wrap up.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. White. Very thoughtful words and great recommendations to all of the questions here. We'll pass along the questions that we didn't get time to respond to today so that you can see those. And I just want to thank everyone again for attending today and remind you that we do have our 4th seminar in the series on December 8th. And that will be focused on sea level rise, particularly in the Stockton area, and the distributive impacts of flooding risk. So thank you again. Thanks for being here, Dr. White, and see you all soon.